Well, today is a very unique Sunday where we are all gathering together via technology. And think about that. What a unique time in history to live, to where when times are uncertain or there are difficulties, that we can still all gather together. And so I want to welcome every single one of you. If you're sitting in your living room and you're drinking coffee, that is awesome. Or if you're sitting at your table and you're looking at your computer and you're eating Lucky Charms, I'm a little bit jealous because I love Lucky Charms and especially those marshmallows. However you're connecting, I am just so incredibly grateful to be with you. And today is a great time to tune in because we are kicking off a brand new series that we're going to be in over the next several weeks called Signs. And I want to give you kind of a roadmap where we're going over the next several weeks. So we're going to be looking at the life of Jesus Christ, and we're going to look at a lot of events in the life of Jesus Christ, but specifically, we're going to look at the miracles in his life. And something very unique about this series is that we're going to kind of go on this tour or this journey in the life of Jesus with a man named John. Maybe you've heard him referred to as the Apostle John or Saint John, all the same guy. And what's unique about John is John was the best friend of Jesus. In fact, John was the closest follower of Jesus. So we're going to get a very unique perspective on the life, the events, and the miracles of Jesus Christ. And my hope throughout this series is that we clear up a lot of confusion when it comes to Jesus, but also that we clear up a lot of confusion, which I know there is, when it comes to the miracles of Jesus Christ. And this whole series is going to wrap up on Easter with the greatest miracle of all, when Jesus Christ rose from the dead. So today, to begin our time, I want us to look at what John says in his letter is a tension. And this is a tension I think we all have faced. This is a tension we have all felt. Perhaps your family members have talked about this tension. And to explain what I'm getting at is here's what I want you to think about. Perhaps the two most misunderstood words, or perhaps the two most misused words in all of religion, specifically Christianity, are these words: faith and belief. Faith and belief. Now, here's what I want you to think about. When it comes to these two words, I think we all know what they mean. And I think if we were able to kind of take religion or take God or take theology or doctrine just for a second, not too long, and we were to kind of set it to the side, and then I was to look at you and I was to say, hey, define these words. I think we all could do this. I mean, when it comes to our home, when it comes to the marketplace, when it comes to school, with your biology professor, with your English professor, we all understand the definition of faith and belief. But for some reason, and I can't quite explain it, for some reason, when it comes to religion, specifically Christianity, the definition is so incredibly confusing. I mean, just think about this a second. When it comes to your home or when it comes to school or professors or the marketplace, I mean, we all know faith and belief, it means this, is that we believe based on the evidence. That as we look at the evidence, we go, hey, we believe. We've been able to test it, we looked at it, and we know it makes sense to us, and therefore we believe in. Maybe think of it this way. Think about when you were a little boy or a little girl, perhaps you had this kind of chemistry set where you had these flasks and you had this microscope. I mean, one of the things that you would do is you would fill these flasks with, liquids and different things, and maybe you put them on a Bunsen burner and you would heat them up and you would test certain things. And as a result of the test and as a result of your observations, you would believe in. You would put your faith in because there was evidence of it. Or maybe when it came to a microscope, you can imagine this as a little boy, little girl, that maybe you did what I did. I would go to the pond and I would get that pond water and I would, bring a bucket back and I would bring it next to my microscope, and then I would get the little slide and put some pond water on it and I would look into the microscope. And when I would look in and look at the pond water, it would be full of things that are moving around, and I'd make these observations. I couldn't see them with my human eye, but with the microscope, I could see the evidence. And I had faith in the fact that there are things moving in pond water. Why? Because of the evidence. You see, I think we all know that. I think we would all say, yeah, I know the definition of belief in faith. And not only do we believe based on the evidence, but in addition to that, we believe based on the confidence in the person delivering the information. I mean, if you have somebody with a PhD or you have somebody, who's gone through a tragedy or a big difficulty in life, and they're speaking on that subject matter or they're speaking on what they've been educated around, I mean, we all lean into that and say, I have confidence in, I have faith in, I put my trust in what they're saying. Because of the person who's saying it, we have confidence in them. For example, something I've shared with you guys for quite a while is that growing up in middle school and high school and college and a little bit after college, golf was a big part of my life. And I remember in high school, because of just some of the successes I had, which I'm grateful for, I was able to play in college. And one of my college golf tournaments was actually in Arizona. And I remember we were doing a practice round, and I was walking around the golf course. There were two other guys with me, and we came to hole number 12. And as I'm walking up to the tee box, I look off in the distance, and I see someone. And do you know who I see? This guy right here, Phil Mickelson. Can you imagine that? And I started to just get all nervous on the inside, and I was so excited because this is one of the greatest golfers of all time, one of the greatest amateurs, one of the greatest college golfers of all time. So the three of us, we all walk up there, and we see Phil, and he's meeting, everybody who's playing these practice rounds, and I get to shake his hand, which I'm like, that is awesome. And then we get to talk, and I'm talking with Phil, and I just said, hey, you hit one of the greatest flop shots of all time. And a flop shot's a shot that you hit, kind of goes straight up and lands straight, pretty quickly. And it's really high. It's such a strategic golf shot. And so I said, Phil, how do you hit it? And he said, well, here's how you do it. And he began to, show me. And he said, for a right-hander, grip it a little bit harder here, and then put your knees here and your shoulders here, and your wrist and the whole thing. He goes through this whole kind of, sequence of things. And at the end of it, I put my faith in, my confidence in, my belief in Phil Mickelson. Why? Because he's one of the greatest golfers of all time. And my point is this. You see, when it comes to your life and my life, home life, marketplace, when it comes to school, our professors, etc., we know what believe and faith means. That we believe based on the evidence, and we believe based on the confidence in the person delivering the information. But here's what's interesting, and here's what I want you to think about. When these two words, faith and belief, when it comes to religion, when it comes specifically to Christianity, for some reason, we have hijacked these definitions, and it becomes extraordinarily confusing. To illustrate what I mean, think about this. You see, when it comes to faith, or when it comes to belief in Christianity or in religion, oftentimes I think it's kind of like this big jar, this big empty jar. And here's what happens is that, the religious leader of the church is going to tell you, hey, you need to have faith. You need to believe in. You need to put your trust in this thing right here. And if you do, God's going to bless you. If you do, you're going to experience this richness. If you do, you're going to be forgiven. You're going to experience something better. And as a reasonable person, you're going, there's nothing in there. And they look at you and they're like, no, you just need to have faith. There is something. I have experienced it, and I want you to experience what's in here. And that creates confusion. In other words, if I had to kind of put some handles on this and describe what I'm getting at, here's what I would say. I'd say when it comes to religion, when it comes to Christianity, religious faith and belief are often divorced from reason and confused with emotion and hope. That it's all about this idea that you just need to have the emotion. You just need to have hope in this kind of empty jar. And hope is that idea to go, I hope he shows up. I hope he shows up. Well, did he show up last time or the time before? No, but I hope he shows up. I mean, hope has very little, if anything, to do with faith and belief. But when it comes to religion, when it comes to Christianity, it's like, just believe. Just put your faith in here, this kind of subjective, ooey gooey, like hocus pocus. What does that even look like? And then when you ask questions about, hey, it's an empty jar. What am I supposed to put my faith in? What does this look like? And you begin to use reason and logic, then oftentimes here's the response, is that then you're told, well, you just have to believe. You just have to believe. And if you're from the South and grew up kind of in a conservative Southern church, they add this, well, you just have to believe, brother. Just believe, brother. And you're like, are we related? What's going on, right? And then in addition to that, sometimes we'll say, hey, you just have to take it by faith. And this just creates so much confusion. And do you know where it really creates confusion? It creates confusion when there's tragedies. It creates confusion when there's uncertainty. It creates confusion when life is difficult or a loved one is sick. Because in those times you think about, well, what am I supposed to do? And do you know what the church tells you? Just have more faith. Just have more faith. And you think to yourself, what does that mean? Does that mean I need to muster up some more emotion? What does that mean? And it creates confusion. It creates a lot of hurt. And do you know where else this creates confusion? It creates confusion when people are putting their faith and trust in Jesus Christ. Explain what I mean by that is, about 3 weeks ago, I was meeting with a friend of mine, and he comes to North Point, and he's not a Christian. And he's curious, he's open, and we were just talking about life and about God and all this kind of stuff. And he looked at me and he said, hey, Buck, I wish I had what you had. And I looked at him and I went, what do you mean? He said, I wish I had your kind of faith. And I was like, well, tell me what my kind of faith is. And he said, your kind of faith is the kind of faith that you just have this ability to kind of jump this subjective chasm, or you have the ability to have this emotion to believe in something that simply is not there. I mean, I want that. I want to experience the things you talk about. I just can't get myself to believe in an empty jar, if you will. And I looked at him and I said, well, that's not my kind of faith. That's not the kind of belief I have at all. And so we talked about that. And as I think about this whole concept of religion and how we define faith, specifically in Christianity, it's just confusing. And it's not only confusing to me, but do you know who else this would be confusing to? It would be confusing to John, the closest friend of Jesus Christ, the best friend of Jesus. I mean, who wrote an incredible letter about the life of Jesus. John, if he heard this, well, you just need to believe, brother. Just take it by faith, sister. His response to that would be, really? Says who? I mean, Peter, the first century leader of the church, Peter the rock. I mean, his response to this would be, are you kidding me? I mean, who told you that? Says who? And if you talk to Jesus about this concept of just have more emotion, have more of this subjective, hey, just have more faith. Jesus would say to us, he would say, listen, I talked about faith and belief all the time, but you will not find that kind of definition in anything I've said. So here's the deal, guys. When it comes to these two words, faith and belief, today I want to just clear up some of the confusion around these words. And my hope for every single one of us is that we can take a step of clarity, regardless if you're a Christian or not, that we can take a step of clarity around two very significant terms, faith and belief. And so the way I want to do that, the way I want to kind of get some clarity around this, is I want us together to look at the Gospel of John, the letter of John. Now, the reason why it's called the Gospel of John is because gospel means good news, and John, who stood at the cross of Jesus, and Jesus looked at John and said, John, take care of my mom, and mom, take care of John. That John, in his letter, he documents the life and the teachings and the events of Jesus Christ. And the life of Jesus Christ is good news. That's why it's called the Gospel of John. Now, in John's letter, he does something really unique. What John does in his letter is John gives us the purpose. In fact, at the end of John's letter, here's what he says. He says, here's the purpose of all these events, and here's the purpose of writing everything down. He said, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. In other words, what he's saying here, he's saying, guys, hey, Jesus performed so many different things. There were so many events and so many miracles and so many things Jesus did. I couldn't record them all. But I did record a select few in this book. Now, book isn't the Bible. Book is the letter he's writing, the letter of John. And here's what he says. Why did I do that? Why did I capture all these events? These are written that you may believe. Not only that you may know the events of Jesus Christ, but that you may put your belief in, your trust in, based on the evidence that I am showing you. And again, John's not saying, hey, I want you to have this emotional experience. I want you to have this subjective. I want you to put your belief in this. No, John's saying, guys, I'm going to document it. I'm going to write about historical events. I'm going to write the words Jesus said. I'm going to do everything I can to capture what happened in human history so that you could examine the evidence. And after examining the evidence, you can put your trust in, your faith in. And then the question becomes, Faith in what? Believe in what? Well, John says, believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And when you and I believe that Jesus is the Messiah, we put our faith in based upon the evidence, there's a result. And the result is this, that when you believe in the Son of God, by believing, you may have life in his name. Life to the full. Life abundantly. Life with meaning. Life with purpose. Life knowing that you are forgiven for whatever happened in the past. A life that ultimately is eternal life. And Jesus looks at you and me, and he invites us into this kind of life. John says, that's why I'm documenting all these events. Now, something else that's really interesting about the letter of John, not only does he give us the purpose, but all throughout his letter, as he talks about the events of Jesus Christ, he talks about these things, miracles, where Jesus did things that you can't really explain. That just kind of defy the laws of physics. And you're like, how did this happen? He talks about miracle after miracle. But what's so unique and distinct about the letter of John is John doesn't call miracles miracles. You know what John calls them? John calls miracles signs. And in fact, a miracle is a sign, and a sign points to something beyond itself. In other words, John's saying this, he's saying, hey, when Jesus performed these miracles, they weren't some random acts, or they weren't some, hey, Jesus is trying to be kind and show off, and hey, look at this, and look at my abilities here. No, there was purpose behind these miracles. Miracles are a sign, and a sign points to something beyond. Oftentimes, a sign points to some truth, and oftentimes, that is a bigger truth. And that's a big deal. Because when it came to Jesus, Jesus claimed to be God in a bod, God in a body. And if you're going to make that kind of claim, and you're going to claim to be the Messiah, the chosen one of God, if you hear that, you're going to say, hey, you need to perform, you need to validate, you need to punctuate that kind of claim. And John in his letter says over and over and over, Jesus punctuated his claim that he is the Son of the living God through these signs. So today, here's what we're going to do. We are going to look at the very first sign of Jesus Christ. In fact, Jesus' very first sign is when he turned water into wine. Now, for some of you, you would say, hey, this is my favorite one. I love wine. I know Jesus, turned water into wine, and you could be a Christian or not a Christian, and this is your favorite sign. So before we jump into this miracle, I want to give you a little bit of context to what's going on here. So Jesus' ministry was a 3-year ministry. In 3 years, think about this, he changed the world, which is phenomenal to think about. And in that 3-year time, all the incredible events, everything that Jesus did, but at the very beginning of his 3-year ministry, within the first couple days of that 3-year ministry, Jesus was walking on the Jordan River. And he came upon a man named John the Baptist. And John the Baptist was in the Jordan River. There were thousands of people, around John the Baptist. And John looks over and he sees Jesus. And he says, look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Well, people heard that. And they began looking at Jesus, and John's disciples heard this. And then several individuals were curious about that. Guys like Andrew and Peter, guys like James and John the one writing this letter, guys like Nathaniel and Philip, and they were so curious about, is Jesus the Messiah? Is he really the unique Son of God? And there was an emotional appeal to that, but they wanted evidence. They wanted to say, hey, where's the evidence to that kind of claim? So they began following Jesus. And so at this point in time, it's just a few days into Jesus' 3-year ministry. And it's not all 12 disciples, it's just a few disciples. There's Philip and Nathaniel and Andrew and John, who's writing this letter, all these guys. So there's about 6 disciples. They're following Jesus first few days. This happens at the Jordan River. And then they go to a place called Cana. And here's what happens. On the 3rd day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, Mary, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. So here's what's going on. There's a big wedding festival, and it's important to know, in the first century, a wedding wasn't like a 2-hour event or a 4-hour event or, a 5-minute event, depending how you get married. But a wedding was something that lasted an entire week. The wedding celebration was all these festivities, food and drink for an entire week. And so this wedding had been going on for a couple days. Mary was in charge of some of the hospitality. She was part of that team. And Jesus and a few of his disciples, John and Peter, they come walking up a couple days into this wedding celebration. And here's what takes place. It continues. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." In other words, Jesus' mom does exactly what a normal mom would do. I mean, she's in a pinch, she's in a pickle, and she's going, "Oh my gosh, we ran out of wine." That is a huge mess up in a 7-day celebration. I mean, there are days to go. There's wine needed. And so she does what moms do. "Hey, son, can you help? Hey, son, here's a problem. Can you help me with this?" And so Jesus hears Mary, and then he responds to his mom, and he responds in a way that may be a little bit shocking initially. He responds to Mary, "Woman, woman." And here's the deal. If you're sitting in your living room right now or you're around your wife or around, your mom, I wouldn't suggest using this term. It's probably not going to work out well for you, right? And here's the thing. Oftentimes we hear this and we're like, "Woman, Jesus, that's so disrespectful." But here's what we need to know. This letter was originally written in Greek. And in the Greek, this is not a disrespectful term. This term is equivalent to something like ma'am, or, like sometimes we'll say yes, ma'am, or ma'am when our mom says something. That's what this is like. This is a term of respect. So Jesus hears the situation. He looks at Mary and he says, "Woman, ma'am." And he continues, "Why do you involve me?" Jesus replied, "My hour has not yet come." And here's what he's saying. He's saying, "Come on, Mom. Mom, here's the deal. You know who I am. You know I'm at the beginning of the 3-year ministry, or this ministry. Mom, you've known who I am from the time I was a baby. And you know I didn't come to save the wine. I came to save the world. Come on, Mom, what are you doing? What are you doing?" And Mary, she gets it. She totally understood this, and she goes, I get it. She respects Jesus, and we know that by her reply. She said, Mary said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." In other words, I trust him. This is my son. Like, hey, Jesus, totally respect that. I know your purpose isn't to save the wine, but to save the world. So do whatever you see fit. And so Jesus is standing there in this moment. He's thinking to himself and just kind of looking around, and he sees something. And he goes, "This is a perfect opportunity for the first sign." So what does Jesus do? What does he see? Well, nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Now, this is important. And the reason why this is important is because everybody at the wedding celebration, everybody standing there with Jesus, when they saw those 6 jars, they knew exactly what those 6 jars represented. Those 6 jars represented something old. Those 6 jars represented the covenant between God and exclusively the people of Israel. I mean, those 6 jars were to keep the people ceremonially clean. In other words, I have a right standing or a good standing with God because of these jars. He knew that these jars symbolically represented something that was old and something that had an expiration date. Because he knew the prophet said, hey, this covenant between God and the nation of Israel one day will expire. And God will do something new into the world. He's going to send a Messiah into the world to introduce a brand new covenant. Not between God and the nation of Israel, but this brand new covenant is between God and the whole world. And Jesus is standing there. Imagine this moment. And he looks at these 6 jars and he goes, perfect. A perfect metaphor, a perfect moment to foreshadow what I am here to do, to introduce something brand new through the old. And here's what happens. Continues. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. I love the commentary from F.F. Bruce, and F.F. Bruce is a British theologian, a great thinker, and he wrote a commentary on the letter of John. And in these verses, he gives us a richer context. And here's what F.F. Bruce says. He says, the water provided for purification is laid down by Jewish law and custom, stands for the whole ancient order of Jewish ceremony, which Christ was to replace with something, look at this, better. And Jesus thought to himself, what an opportunity. What a cool moment to introduce something brand new. He's foreshadowing. There's something old. I am here to introduce something not as an addition to, but something brand new. Perfect moment. So what happens? Well, the story continues. Then he told them, now draw some out and take it to the master of banquet. The master of banquet was the person in charge of all the food and all the drink to make sure, all the food and everything was just proper, or was just exactly as it needed to be. So you would go to him first. And so they bring it to the master of banquet. And then here's what happens. They did so. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. And then look at what happens. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. In other words, he's like, hey, once people get toasty, once they get drunk, their frontal lobes are all dulled, their reasoning's gone, and you can bring out the cheap wine, and they're going to drink it. They're going to go, oh, this is fantastic. Like, that's how parties go. He's like, this is so unusual. And then he finishes by saying, but you have saved the best until now. And so had God. That God had saved the best until now in human history for you and for me. This was Jesus' first sign, his first miracle. And guys, it's so important to understand that this was more than a miracle. It was a sign. And it was a sign to point to something beyond, a truth that is a big, big truth, that Jesus has come to introduce something brand new. Jesus is the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham 2,000 years earlier. Jesus is the Son of the living God. And this is the first sign to punctuate it. And all this takes place, and John is taking meticulous notes, and there's Peter and Andrew and Philip and the guys, they're watching all this. And the whole passage wraps up this way. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory. And his disciples put their what? Put their faith in him. Now, why'd they put their faith in Jesus? Did they put their belief in because of this kind of subjective reasoning or this empty jar, you just got to have more faith? Was it some emotional response? No. You know why they put their faith in Jesus Christ and their belief? Because they looked at the evidence. They looked at his life. They looked at what he said. They looked at what he claimed. And they looked at the signs that validated and punctuated the very things Jesus claimed. And based off the evidence, they leaned in, they trusted in, they put their confidence in, their faith in the person of Jesus Christ. You see, what's so important to understand is that when it comes to John, when it comes to Peter, when it comes to all these kind of first century, the disciples, the apostles, the first century followers of Jesus Christ, you see, when they put their faith in, when they put their trust in, they did that as a result of seeing. Because these first century followers of Jesus Christ, they saw his life. They saw the events. They saw the signs. They had a front row seat. They were eyewitnesses to something that happened in history. And as a result, they put their faith in. Now, that's important. Because today, in the 21st century, today when it comes to putting our faith in, putting our belief in, it's not a result of seeing. It's a result of hearing. Because we begin to hear these eyewitness testimonies who saw something happen in human history. And here's the deal. You may push back on this. You may say, well, Buck, no, I became a follower of Jesus Christ because of what I saw. And I wouldn't argue with that. In fact, several years ago, I met with perhaps the smartest man I ever met with in my life. He's, very objective, very logical. He told me his story about, how he became a follower of Jesus and put his faith in. And he talked about the fact that he was an atheist. All of his colleagues, everybody in his kind of field, they were all atheists. And he said, one day, I saw something, Buck. And he began to describe that, and he said, I saw something. And so that night, after I saw things I just couldn't explain, I went home and I read the entire New Testament. Imagine that, the entire New Testament. And as a result of what I saw and what I read and what I heard, I put my faith in Jesus Christ. I think that happens. I think people will tell stories and say, well, I saw that individual, or I saw that couple, and I wanted what they had. So therefore, it led to things that led me to put my faith in Jesus. I think that happens, but for the far majority of us, I think we put our faith and trust as a result of hearing. But when you hear that, the pushback is, well, I'm just looking at the evidence of these eyewitnesses who were there in the first century, but I don't know if that's enough for me. And so here's what I want you to think about, and you may disagree with this, and that's fine. But here's the deal. When it comes to evidence that Jesus is who he claimed to be, when it comes to the historical evidence, when it just comes to Jesus Christ and putting our faith, guys, there is a plethora of evidence to say that Jesus is who he claimed to be. There is plenty of evidence. In fact, just to illustrate, give you a few examples of this. And I think of an individual by the name of Lee Strobel. Lee Strobel worked for the Chicago Tribune. Lee Strobel was an investigative reporter. And Lee Strobel was an atheist. And he was like, I'm out on God, I'm out on Christianity, the whole thing. And his wife was also an atheist. But then something happened. His wife became a Christian. And when his wife became a Christian, he was like, are you kidding me? This is the last thing I ever thought would happen in my marriage. And he was so upset about this because he thought, it's ridiculous. This is just a bunch of made up stories from some peasants and some religious leader who wanted, his glory or something. And he was so upset about it that he decided to take his skills and his investigative reporting kind of skill set and go investigate this to go like, I'm going to prove to my wife this is all not true. And so over the course of time, he began to meet with historians, archaeologists, theologians, atheists, everybody you could imagine with. And he sits down and he does an investigative report to prove to his wife this is nonsense. And over time, as he began to look at the evidence, Lee Strobel put his faith in Jesus Christ and went from an atheist to a follower of Jesus. And what's so cool for you and I is we have his evidence. In fact, he wrote a book, and his book is called The Case for Christ. And in this, it just documents, here's the research, here's his investigative reporting, and based on the evidence that you can put your faith in Jesus Christ. And I think of people like C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was one of the greatest kind of British thinkers of his time and one of the greatest intellectuals. And C.S. Lewis, I love his story because he says the last thing in the world he wanted to become was a Christian. In fact, as you read his biography, he says, I was an atheist from the time I was age 15. I believed my worldview was all about this is all meaningless. There is no purpose to life. And then he said, I looked at the evidence. And then he said, I had no other choice to become or not to become a Christian. And here's the thing. He phrased it this way. He said, I came kicking and screaming to Christianity because of the evidence. The last thing in the world he wanted to do was put his faith in Jesus, but the evidence was overwhelming. Makes me think like people, like my mom. My mom, when she was 30 years old, she could not stand religion. She could not stand Christianity or any of that. In fact, the first 10 years of my life, I never went to church. I never, for Easter, Christmas, never went because she so despised religion. And at the age of 30, she was all about success and all about climbing the ladder of leadership. She's a great leader. And she was at a leadership conference and she was listening to the keynote speaker. And they were talking about, Jesus and his leadership skills and what he accomplished in 3 years and the whole thing. And then she heard this term, grace. Amazing grace. And as she listened to what grace is, this unmerited, unconditional love of God, it began to appeal to her emotion. She wanted that to be true. She wanted to experience it. But my mom was a thinker. And she said, I just don't think there's evidence, but I'll look for it. And she began looking, and she came across a book that is called Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell. This is a 700-page book that looks at archaeological claims, that looks at historical claims, that looks at manuscript evidence, and looks at the scriptures and the Bible, and that there's no other work of antiquity like it. Nothing compares to it. And as she read these 700 pages, she came to a place in her life to put her faith in, to put her belief in, not because of an emotion, but because the evidence. She put her faith in Jesus Christ. And that's what John's doing. John's just capturing the historical life, the historical events, and the historical signs of Jesus. And do you know why? Here's why. He says, I wrote all this for you, that all these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Belief not based upon an emotion, belief based on the evidence that I am presenting. So guys, here's the deal. Here's my hope for you. You know, if you're in your living room, or maybe in your car, maybe you're at the table, you kind of gather together, maybe with your family, and you would say that you are a follower of Jesus Christ, my greatest hope for you over the next several weeks, culminating on Easter, is that as we take steps and begin to look at these signs and look at what John says about the life of Jesus Christ, my greatest hope for you is that you take a step and you grow in your faith, that you grow in your trust in, that you grow in your confidence in the person of Jesus Christ. And my hope, the reason I hope for that, is because in times like this, times of uncertainty, times to where there is fear, times to where there is worry about what's going to happen tomorrow, one of the greatest things we could do is remind ourselves why we believe what we believe. And taking a step of faith does that. And if you're here today or tuning in today and you would say, Buck, I'm not a Christian, I haven't taken that step, then my greatest hope for you over the next several weeks is that you begin to poke on this and ask questions, and ultimately, by the time Easter happens, my greatest hope is that you come to a place in your life to take a step, to put your faith in, to put your trust in Jesus Christ and experience what he says you will experience. Life to the full. Let me go ahead and pray for us. Father, thank you so much for this moment. Thank you that we can connect in this time, in this age, in this way, that we can still gather together. God, thank you for the reminder through the letter of John that you have preserved over these years, that you are for us, and it's demonstrated through your Son, Jesus Christ. I'm so grateful for that. And Father, I just ask for every single one of us, regardless of where we're at with our faith, that throughout the next several weeks, we can all take a step and grow in our belief and grow in our faith. In Jesus' name, amen.